è il conferimento dei premi in ambito teologico intitolati a Joseph Ratzinger in Vaticano ogni anno alla presenza di Papa Francesco. Tuttavia è innegabile che questa iniziativa dei premi Razón Abierta con il Congresso Razón Abierta è andata sviluppandosi negli anni fino ad oggi di fatto quasi come una terza iniziativa, l'unica terza iniziativa istituzionale della Fondazione Vaticana Benedetto XVI. Le ragioni di questa singolare evoluzione sono tre. La prima è la serietà di questa università che ci ha immediatamente colpito da quando abbiamo fatto qui uno dei convegni della Fondazione sulla preghiera, forza che cambia il mondo. Tutti nella Fondazione furono colpiti dalla organizzazione, dall'efficacia, dal cuore col quale l'importanza che questa università dà a un tema che è molto caro a Benedetto XVI, prima ancora di lui naturalmente a Giovanni Paolo II e adesso a Papa Francesco, ed è il significato e l'importanza della questione educativa, della questione della trasmissione delle conoscenze, che è il problema centrale per una società che voglia avere un minimo di consapevolezza civile, dunque un minimo di tenuta. Quando l'educazione non funziona, quando la trasmissione della conoscenza non funziona, e innanzitutto a livello giovanile e universitario, prima o poi la società si sfalda. Questo è all'origine del pensiero occidentale e oggi purtroppo ne vediamo le conseguenze. Ecco, questa università a noi è sembrato, al nostro comitato scientifico e poi anche a tutti gli altri organismi della Fondazione, che abbia assunto una particolare consapevolezza che forse le università, innanzitutto le università cattoliche naturalmente, avevano cercato moltissime cose, avevano anche accumulato moltissime cose, ma forse sacrificato un po' la consapevolezza del significato e dell'importanza della questione educativa come tale. In un recente saggio centrale di Benedetto XVI, che sto traducendo adesso, sull'Europa dell'89, che leggevo ieri nell'aereo venendo qui, mi ha colpito molto che lui lega il termine conoscenza, il termine di una conoscenza più ricca, più approfondita, anche etimologicamente al termine coscienza, conscienza, una scienza maggiore. Ecco, non voglio sviluppare il tema, ma mi limito a dire che questo quadro, questa urgenza, tanto forte da dedicare il 20 maggio prossimo Papa Francesco di fatto una giornata mondiale alla questione educativa, questa urgenza è stata sempre ed è molto presente, sempre presente dagli inizi della nostra collaborazione, ma molto presente e molto presente alla Università Francisco da Vittoria, tanto da un po' come gli scopritori degli altri continenti, da mandare le proprie navi alla scoperta di terre sconosciute ma fertili da questo punto di vista in tutto il mondo. Ecco, perciò ribadisco il grande interesse, insieme alla grande stima e gratitudine della Fondazione per questa iniziativa, per i premi, per i congressi, assicurando anche per il futuro la nostra piena collaborazione, il nostro pieno appoggio a un progetto e a una iniziativa che devo testimoniare a Roma, anche al di là delle frontiere della Fondazione e dei suoi organismi, sta suscitando una crescente attenzione, interesse e ammirazione. Grazie.
Muchas gracias. A continuación tiene la palabra el rector magnífico de la Universidad Francisco de Vitoria, don Daniel Sada Castaño.
Gracias, Pierluca, y creo que en nombre de todos te pedimos que le des un abrazo con mucho cariño al padre Lombardi, porque sabemos lo que le gustaría estar aquí. Apreciamos y nos edifica especialmente que quiera estar al lado de un amigo y de un miembro de su comunidad que está en sus últimos días y que quiere acompañarle en este momento. Creo que la mejor manera de inaugurar algo, en general de hacer casi cualquier cosa, es dar contexto, saber por qué se está o para qué, cuál es el propósito de que estemos aquí, por qué un congreso y por qué Razón Abierta. Y declarando desde el principio que hay un propósito de que todos ustedes estén aquí, lo tenemos con este congreso, no solo para compartir conocimiento, para lo que se suele hacer en los congresos, sino para algo más, como ahora explicaré. Y el contexto, la mejor forma de explicarlo es acudiendo a nuestra historia, mirando la historia que nos ha traído hasta aquí. Y lo que nos ha traído, intentando hacer el cuento muy breve, es que esta universidad católica y universidad, como otras muchas, desde que nació, acabamos de cumplir 25 años, se quiso preguntar qué significa ser universidad, qué significa ser universidad católica y qué significa ser esta universidad católica, Universidad Francisco de Vitoria. ¿Cuál es nuestra misión que estamos llamados a aportar? ¿Para qué se nos pone en las manos este regalo? ¿Para qué Dios nos pone en las manos este regalo de cara a lo que tengamos que hacer? Y en esa reflexión y en esa pregunta fuimos descubriendo durante los primeros años, cada vez con más intensidad y por otro lado, pues logrando ver con claridad lo que los textos pontificios y los papas y gente tan actual como Newman, cuya canonización será dentro de poco, nos vienen diciendo, fuimos descubriendo que una universidad en realidad no es católica porque sepa defender o mostrar los signos de su catolicidad, los signos externos, una capilla en el campus, crucifijos en las aulas, ni siquiera porque tenga un departamento de pastoral que sea activo y que ofrezca actividades y que te puedas confesar con un cura y que puedas ir a misa y que haya misiones y que haya peregrinaciones y cualquier actividad directamente de la pastoral, ni siquiera porque en sus currícula incluya un porcentaje más o menos importante de humanidades, de teología, de doctrina social de la Iglesia. Todo eso está muy bien, pero todo eso le falta algo en el núcleo, en la esencia de lo que se debiera entender por una universidad católica. Y fuimos descubriendo, enfrentándonos al reto enorme de querer entender que una universidad católica lo será si usa católicamente la razón, porque una universidad está para usar la razón. Y si en sus aulas y en las ciencias que enseña y que investiga se produce lo que Benedicto XVI recoge de muchos otros textos que se podrían, pero que él enfatiza especialmente y lo enriquece enormemente con el término razón abierta, con el término de pensar más allá de los horizontes de la razón, y superar lo que por otro lado pues parece que es un lugar común, todo el mundo habla de ello, pero esto de este cruce de tendencias, que era la tendencia a la búsqueda de la unidad del saber, que protagonizó durante muchos siglos la vida de la universidad, y el impulso que parece antagónico de la especialización. Y parece que estamos en un momento de conciliar estos dos impulsos y de plantearnos que seguramente en nuestro caso lo hemos bautizado con el término de repensar, debemos repensar las ciencias, o tenemos que pensarlas, investigarlas y enseñarlas desde una razón abierta que permita que esas ciencias que tienen preguntas dentro de sí que no pueden responder desde su método propio y tienen que acudir a otras ciencias mayores, que son la filosofía y la teología, para responder a preguntas que subyacen y que son completamente esenciales para esa ciencia o esa disciplina. Bueno, esto es lo que expusimos en el Congreso de 2011, cuando vino el Papa Benedicto XVI a España y se hizo un Congreso Internacional de Universidades en Ávila. Fue nuestra aportación, formó parte de las conclusiones del Congreso. Hemos estado haciendo un camino que ha estado jalonado pues, por muchas cosas, entre otras cosas ponernos en búsqueda de otros que pensaran así, que quisieran hacer esto en cualquier universidad, católica o no católica del mundo. Y hemos contactado con universidades, con departamentos, con claustros de profesores o con profesores individuales. Y hace 3 años decidimos proponer a la Fundación Ratzinger convocar juntos, entre otras cosas en homenaje al Papa Benedicto XVI y a su pensamiento, convocar juntos unos premios que pudieran atraer mundialmente, que pudieran ser una señal de humo para ser vista desde lejos a gente que esté en este empeño, que entienda que su asignatura, su disciplina particular, de verdad, si quiere hacer una aportación o si quiere sumarse a la corriente evangelizadora de la cultura y del pensamiento, pues no la puede pensar de manera fragmentada. Y por eso tiene que ponerse en camino, junto con humanistas y filósofos y teólogos, en camino para hacer una síntesis real en esa materia particular. Y bueno, estos son los 3 años que en esta tercera edición de los premios pensamos que sería una buena cosa aprovechar para organizar un congreso y que pudiéramos hacer lo que por otro lado es inexcusable, que es que seamos capaces de conocernos, de vernos las caras y de funcionar en red, porque los esfuerzos individuales sabemos el recorrido que tienen, ¿no? Entonces este reto, que lo entendemos para todas las universidades católicas del mundo y otras no católicas, y para muchísimos profesores que están preocupados y que se pueden sumar a este esfuerzo, pues nos gustaría ser una pequeña aportación para facilitar este encuentro, para conocer lo que hacen otros, para intentar entender en qué consiste este camino del repensamiento de las ciencias y para intentar multiplicarlo exponencialmente y hacerlo fecundo para ese propósito y esa encomienda que tenemos todos de la evangelización del mundo de la cultura y del pensamiento. Quiero terminar agradeciendo pues, al Instituto Razón Abierta, al Instituto Newman, que dentro de la universidad han impulsado este congreso, y a los departamentos interiores que se esfuerzan para acogernos hoy aquí, para que estos 2 días y medio sean lo más propicios, y entre otras cosas para eso hay que encontrarse a gusto. Ojalá se sientan todos ustedes acogidos y a gusto en esta casa, que es la suya. Quiero agradecer muy especialmente a la Fundación Ratzinger, que quiso, a pesar de que tenía muy limitada su actividad y muy específica y muy concreta su actividad, quiso ampliar hace 4 años, cuando nos conocimos con ocasión del congreso que hicimos aquí sobre la oración, quiso ampliar su espectro y iniciar con nosotros este camino que creo que está siendo muy fecundo, muy bonito y con el apoyo de la Fundación lo es más. Y agradecer a todos, bueno, los 426 profesores apuntados al Congreso, que provenís de 52 universidades de 6 países, 79 comunicaciones se han inscrito en el Congreso. En fin, la verdad que es una satisfacción enorme. Todo este esfuerzo merece la pena porque hay gente que lo quiere secundar y ahora conecta con el propósito. El propósito es que a resultas de lo que aquí hagamos y de lo que aquí conozcamos unos de otros, de los contactos que hagamos, del entendimiento que hagamos de esto que se convoca en el Congreso, surja pues eso, una especie de red y de conexión entre los empeños y las cabezas y los corazones que aquí hoy están convocados. Muchas gracias.
Antes de dar paso a la conferencia inaugural, algunas cuestiones prácticas. En primer lugar, dos anuncios. El primero es que hemos abierto al público el depósito digital que recoge muchos de los trabajos que se han ido presentando a los premios Razón Abierta en estas 3 ediciones. El objetivo no es solo reunir y archivar esos trabajos y ponerlos a disposición de todo el mundo, sino generar esa comunidad Razón Abierta que creemos que es tan importante, porque en este camino no podemos avanzar en soledad, sino que tenemos que avanzar en comunidad. Entonces, os iremos proporcionando el acceso al depósito y esperamos que sea verdaderamente una herramienta útil para ese avance en comunidad. Y en segundo lugar, también tengo el placer de comunicar que tenemos ya las actas del Congreso, de la segunda edición del Congreso, que están colgadas en la página web de los premios Razón Abierta y que todos los que os habéis inscrito en el Congreso recibiréis personalmente en vuestro correo electrónico. Y luego, dos aspectos prácticos. Uno respecto a los pinganillos de la traducción. Quisiera recordaros, por favor, que nadie se los lleve olvidados en el bolso o en el bolsillo y que los dejéis al final de la jornada en las mesas que están puestas ahí en las puertas. Y avisar de que las lenguas utilizadas en el Congreso van a ser español e inglés. No se va a utilizar ninguna otra lengua, por lo que los que sepáis español e inglés, pues no vais a necesitar el pinganillo. Y en segundo lugar, respecto de la comida, todos aquellos que venís de fuera y os habéis inscrito en el Congreso podéis utilizar vuestros vales para la comida en la cafetería del Colegio Mayor. Hemos reservado ese espacio para que podamos comer allí todos, no solo los que vienen con la inscripción y con el vale, sino todos nosotros, y así aprovechar ese rato de la comida para seguir pues en el clima del Congreso y seguir haciendo contactos y generando esa comunidad. And now I'm going to introduce our key speaker, Professor Brad Gregory. In Spanish, if you don't mind. El profesor Brad Gregory es catedrático de Historia y titular de la Cátedra Universitaria Dorothy Griffin de la Universidad de Notre Dame, donde ha enseñado desde 2003 y donde también es director del Instituto Notre Dame para Estudios Avanzados. De 1996 a 2003 enseñó en la Universidad de Stanford, donde recibió el cargo a principios de 2001. Se especializó en Historia del Cristianismo en Europa durante la era de la Reforma y la influencia a largo plazo de esta era en el mundo moderno. Ha dado conferencias en muchas de las universidades más prestigiosas de Norteamérica y de todo el mundo. Antes de enseñar en Stanford, obtuvo su doctorado en Historia en la Universidad de Princeton y fue Junior Fellow en la Harvard Society of Fellows. También tiene 2 títulos en Filosofía en la Universidad Católica de Lovaina, en Bélgica. Professor Gregory, we thank you very much for being here with us, and without any more delay, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the kind introduction and welcome. Everyone can hear in the back? Yeah, great. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a wonderful turnout. I also want to thank Max Bonilla for the invitation to deliver this keynote address. And I want to thank all the organizers and others who've worked to make this conference possible. Congratulations, of course, also to this year's winners of the Expanded Reason Awards, and I'm looking forward very much to our time together here at the Universidad Francisco de Vitoria over the next 3 days. I should also mention that my flight was delayed last night, and I didn't get to my hotel until 1 in the morning. So If anything doesn't sound absolutely clear, brilliant, original, and interesting, that's why. Okay. The Expanded Reason Awards website includes remarks by Monsignor Federico Lombardi on the concept of expanded reason prompted by Joseph Ratzinger, who long before becoming Pope Benedict XVI expressed concerns about the predominant intellectual culture of our time, one characterized by, in effect, restricted or contracted reason. This relates to some of the comments that both Pierluca and Daniel have made. We lack a vision of knowledge as a whole, one that can integrate the ever more specialized findings of subfields within disciplines, an overarching vision that seems elusive in proportion to the increase of our knowledge. Despite our ever-increasing technological achievements, there is no shared recognition of the inherent dignity of the human person or of the ethical imperatives closely connected to that dignity, and the most fundamental human questions about values, purpose, and ultimate meaning have been relegated politically and culturally to individual preferences that lie outside of reason understood in any normative or universal sense. Monsignor Lombardi notes the relativism, scientism, and pragmatism of this intellectual culture, which characterizes contemporary universities not only in Europe and North America, but all around the world. I want to suggest today that what underlies it is naturalism, regarded not simply as a methodological assumption in the natural sciences, but increasingly as a comprehensive worldview and a metaphysics. Naturalism is a methodological assumption shared by all of the natural sciences, and quite properly so. It means, for the purposes of scientific explanation, regarding the universe as a whole and everything in it as if it were a closed system of nothing more than matter-energy, explicable through the mechanistic, efficient causality of natural forces. By definition, and as a stipulation for doing science, no reference to anything supernatural or transcendent is permissible, nor is reference allowed to any intention, meaning, value, or purpose. The results have been remarkable since methodological naturalism was pioneered in 17th century mechanics, was extended to 19th century biology through Darwinism, and in the last century has exploded in so many disciplines, including post-Newtonian physics, cosmology, genetics, and neuroscience. Provided the sciences remain within their stipulated self-limitations, they are constantly adding to our knowledge of reality. No problem. But a problem arises when the exponential increase in scientific knowledge is taken as a warrant to inflate the methodological postulate of naturalism into a metaphysical assertion. Then naturalism is made into a comprehensive claim about reality, a worldview that now, I would argue, constitutes part of the de facto framework of our prevailing intellectual culture and of all academic disciplines in the vast majority of universities. When a methodologically provisional as if becomes a metaphysically assertive is, naturalism almost always functions as a synonym for materialism and atheism. Its self-consciously abstractive, reductionist explanatory approach shifts from a proper awareness that questions about transcendence, meaning, purpose, and values are simply not part of its intellectual enterprise, to the unwarranted insistence that, because its methods have failed to find anything transcendent or any inherent meaning in reality, none in fact exists. This is bizarre to say the least. Of course, none of the natural sciences have discovered what they are prohibited from even considering by their own self-constitutive methodological mandate. As a corollary, when naturalism's methodological postulate becomes metaphysical assertion, science is nearly always conjoined with scientism, the ideological position that only the empirical, observational, experimental, mathematizing methods of the natural sciences are justifiable means of pursuing and discovering any truth about reality. I will argue in a few moments that this epistemological imperialism is false, and that metaphysical naturalism itself is based on a fundamental irrationalism. That said, I am committed to the idea of the integral compatibility of all knowledge in principle, ultimately as a matter of logic, and thus of the exercise of reason. In the traditional scholastic formulation, truth cannot contradict truth. Everything that is true must ultimately hang together, even though, of course, there's a great deal we don't know, and even if we can't see how what we do know coheres. But we certainly do have the capacity to grasp, for example, that in 18th century Brandenburg, Johann Sebastian Bach could not have written any of his sublime keyboard music unless neurons were firing in his central nervous system, or without the capacity for symbolic thought that seems to have arisen in our species around 50,000 years ago, or if hominid evolution had not been part of the evolution of life on Earth, extending back more than 4 billion years, or unless the physical elements in the chemical compounds in the molecules of Bach's body had been forged in processes of stellar and supernova nucleosynthesis, and in the case of helium and hydrogen at the time of the Big Bang, 13 billion years ago. Every human creative act, every aesthetic experience, and every heartfelt embrace presupposes what it is that neuroscientists and neurologists, archaeologists and evolutionary anthropologists, evolutionary and cell biologists, biochemists and geochemists, particle physicists and cosmologists study. But this neither means nor implies that, for example, knowledge of Bach's genetic makeup or his ancestry tells us anything about the structure and the harmonies of his toccata and fugue in D minor. It doesn't. Now, why is a Reformation historian going on about all this? I'm simply responding to the conditions of our shared academic environment. Regardless of my discipline or field, and regardless of all of yours, whether we like it or not, the predominant framing assumptions of universities today increasingly include scientism and materialist naturalism. This means we inhabit an intellectual milieu characterized by contracted, restricted reason. There is enormous professional and social pressure to conduct our academic lives as if all reality consists of nothing but and can be nothing more than the natural order of matter, energy, and motion, as if our universe is a closed causal system. Not only if one is a physical chemist or cell biologist, but also if one is an economist or a sociologist, a historian or an art historian. If one wants to be taken seriously, as the saying goes, one is obliged to conduct one's research in a manner consistent with metaphysical naturalism. In most universities, questions that interrogate naturalist assumptions are not even supposed to be asked, and if they are, those with the temerity to ask them are likely to be met with some combination of incomprehension, dismissiveness, mockery, or disdain. I hope that by the end of my talk today, the irony of that dismissive disdain, in institutions no less ostensibly committed to the exercise of self-reflective reason, will become clear. Whether we are aware of them or not, all of us, humanistic scholars, social scientists, and natural scientists, make philosophical assumptions, and we would do well to reflect on what they are and why we hold the ones we do. It is perfectly appropriate for a scholar of, say, modern Spanish literature, or a social psychologist, or a molecular biologist, or any other scholar or scientist to reflect on the framing assumptions of the university institutions and intellectual culture within which we do our work. Those assumptions affect every one of us. Of course, my particular training as a historian shapes the specific ways in which I see my own expertise, early modern European history, in relationship to the history of the human past as a whole, and the relationship of human history to the evolutionary history of hominids and more broadly mammals, and more broadly still to the evolution of life on Earth, and beyond this to the formation of our planet and solar system and galaxy within the history of the universe, and finally to the most fundamental questions about existence and being as such. But whatever our particular research-specific and disciplinary starting points, all reflection along these lines must necessarily converge on the same endpoint if we think seriously about integrating knowledge from different disciplines within a whole. We are all situated within human history at a point very late in the evolution of life on Earth, which itself belongs to the cosmological history of the universe stretching back to the Big Bang, all of which belongs to the domain of ontologically contingent beings. The main argument of my lecture today is that there is a serious problem with the way in which the assumption of naturalism usually functions these days in universities and in the prevailing intellectual culture we inhabit. Anti-transcendent materialist naturalism depends upon forgetting, neglecting, or overlooking a foundational truth of reason about the entirety of the natural order as such, a critical philosophical error that in turn pervades our intellectual culture and exerts an adverse pressure on all the disciplines. One contribution, then, to expanding reason beyond its unjustifiably constricted constraints consists in pointing out this problem on the basis of the exercise of reason itself. This, in turn, has major implications for the concerns raised by Monsignor Lombardi, Pope Emeritus Benedict, and many others, including many of us gathered here, about human dignity, meaning, values, and purpose in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. That is because naturalism, which derives its ideological power as a metaphysics from the explanatory and practical success of the natural sciences, tends to go together with constructivism in the humanities. The idea that all meanings, values, priorities, and norms, including morality, are constructed, that is, invented by human beings. This is precisely because, in the words of the sociologist Christian Smith, in the naturalist universe, quote, there is no inherent ultimate meaning or purpose, and so any meaning or purpose that exists for humans in a naturalistic universe is constructed by and for humans themselves. If there is no meaning, purpose, or value in the natural world per se, of which we are a part as simply another mammalian species that happened randomly to evolve through processes of chance genetic mutation and natural selection, then all human meanings and values can only be constructed. None can be discovered because there are none to be found. Human cultural variety across space and time, as studied by anthropologists and historians, seems to corroborate this claim. Combine this constructivist view with a political commitment to equality, and the link to relativism is obvious. As a corollary of metaphysical naturalism, constructivism therefore readily fits with the individualism championed by liberal political theorists from John Locke to John Rawls, and the conviction that the purpose of politics ought to be the maximal extension of individual rights about what to believe, how to live, and what to care about. Everyone ought to be permitted to construct their own meanings and live as they please, within humanly constructed laws that allow everyone else to do likewise. This example only hints at the ways in which naturalist assumptions affect humanistic scholars and social scientists. As Pope Francis put it in Laudato Si, everything is connected. The plausibility of naturalism as a comprehensive worldview relies ultimately on the nested dependence of all the other disciplines upon physics, within a temporal scheme that stretches from the present back to the beginning of the universe. Nobody can accuse me of not taking on big questions in this talk, right? Okay. This was implicit in my example about Bach a few moments ago. In a naturalist scheme, the vast majority of humanistic scholars in all disciplines study the myriad meaning-laden constructions of one species, Homo sapiens, usually and mostly from about the last 3,000 years. Materialist neuroscientists seek to explain every human experience behind all those constructions, not simply as requiring, but as reducible to neurophysical processes in human brains, processes shared with other species in their respective brains and extending back millions of years into the evolutionary past. Likewise, evolutionary psychologists apply a similar approach to the human behavior studied by humanistic scholars, which not only, obviously, presuppose the reality of human genes and survival-oriented behaviors by human beings who survived, which is actually just a tautology, but are ultimately determined by them. Evolutionary theory is so important among the disciplines as a whole, and neo-Darwinian ideology seems so plausible to the unwary, not only because of the way in which they seek to connect and purport to explain the entirety of the human world in a manner continuous with the rest of life on Earth, but more fundamentally as reducible to the non-living, strictly mechanical processes of chemistry and physics. In the words of Daniel Dennett, a zealous neo-Darwinian evangelist, quote, "The idea of evolution by natural selection unifies the realm of life, meaning, and purpose with the realms of space and time, cause and effect, mechanism, and physical law," unquote. And by unifies, Dennett means reduces to. Hence his delight in the universal acid, as he calls it, of Darwin's dangerous idea. Darwinian evolutionary theory extends to all living things the mechanistic materialism of the 17th century rejection of Aristotelianism in thinkers such as Galileo, Bacon, Descartes, and Newton, repudiating any teleology or intrinsic meaning in the natural world. Without question, because of the staggering advances since the early 20th century in physics, particle physics, astrophysics, cosmology, we know more about the history, character, and makeup of our universe at the most fundamental levels now than ever before, stretching back to the Big Bang some 13.7 billion years ago. The timescales, distances, and mathematically articulated intricacies of what astronomers and physicists have discovered are stunning, as is the bizarre and mysterious character of it all. To give only one example, only a small portion, about 5%, of what falls within the purview of physics consists of the protons, neutrons, and electrons that comprise the elements and compounds studied in chemistry and which, diversely combined in all their dizzying variety, make up the full range of life forms that have ever existed on Earth as studied in the biological sciences. The remaining 95% of the universe, in case you were wondering, consists of dark matter or dark energy, about which physicists know very little. Nevertheless, there's a strong sense in which, for a naturalist, materialist worldview, among the disciplines, physics is, and in a sense has to be, first philosophy. If naturalism is true or plausible, ultimately it is physics that will have to explain how that is so, indeed how it is possible. It turns out that it can't. And not merely because the answer hasn't yet been discovered or physics hasn't yet made sufficient progress, but because it is a category mistake to think that it could. This is the most basic objection to materialist naturalism as a comprehensive account of reality, and I will spend most of the rest of my time discussing it. But the conceptual and logical irrationality of metaphysical naturalism is not its only problem. Numerous scholars have pointed out other difficulties, and this should not be surprising. The insufficiencies of dubious ideas usually disclose themselves in more than one way. The first problem I will note might not be insuperable for a scientistic reductionist fervently devoted to naturalism, but it would rightly unsettle most human beings from all cultures. It is simply that if naturalism is true, there is no reason to think there might be a basis for any objective ethical norms at all. There are only human constructions of morality, shifting according to cultural differences, historical processes, and individual preferences, subjectively overlaid by Homo sapiens on the purposeless substratum of matter energy. Nothing could actually be good or evil, right or wrong, just or unjust, because there are in reality no values, purpose, or meaning. To quote Christian Smith again, matter and energy are not a moral source. They just exist and do what they do. Nor is it apparent how theories of emergence, which have been important in the natural and social sciences in recent years and seek to explain how more complex realities and qualitatively different phenomena can arise from simpler constituent realities, could bridge the gulf between the complete absence and the objective presence of ethical norms. If naturalism is true, then correlatively and obviously there could be no actual basis for human rights, for example, nor any imperative to care about anyone or anything, or to act in certain ways rather than others. Nor could there be any basis besides constructed preferences to condemn any behaviors, no matter how horrific, from a conventional ethical perspective, including genocide, sex trafficking, or slavery. Now, pointing this out is not a refutation of naturalism. Some true believers might be willing to grasp this nettle despite its implications. Nietzsche, for example, seems to have understood that metaphysical naturalism entails an ethical nihilism. But it is difficult to imagine any desirable form of shared human existence compatible with persons acting on such a view. Indeed, the long-standing project of trying to upgrade morality, as it were, by seeking to ground ethics in scientific findings, reflects both a recognition of the centrality of morality in human life and the hope that perhaps the empirical, rigorous methods of the natural sciences could overcome once and for all, with the same authority enjoyed by chemistry and physics, the ethical disagreements characteristic of human life and the divergences among moral philosophers apparent across cultures and throughout human history. This is what in recent years scientists and philosophers such as Patricia Churchland, Owen Flanagan, Joshua Green, and others have been trying to do. They have combined a Humean sentimentalism, a Darwinian account of the evolution of the mind as an epiphenomenon of the brain, and the utilitarian tradition that goes back to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, rooting their efforts in an insistent empirical naturalism. After an extensive review of these efforts, taking account of relevant research in evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, primatology, neuroscience, and social psychology, the sociologists James Davison Hunter and philosopher Paul Netoliski conclude that even taken collectively, all of these efforts have provided, quote, no clear empirical support for any moral theory, let alone for any claim about what is right and wrong, good or evil, or how we should live, unquote. A second problem with metaphysical naturalism is different in kind, less disturbing for human coexistence, but more serious in intellectual terms. It is not simply the inability of materialist naturalism to explain the phenomenon of consciousness in general, including human intentionality, cognition, and rationality, but what multiple philosophers and even some scientists now regard as the impossibility of doing so. Any and every attempt at a psychophysical reduction of first-person experiential awareness to nothing but neurophysiological and ultimately strictly physical processes has not only failed, but looks as though it is bound to fail. In 2011, the distinguished research physician and clinical neuroscientist Raymond Tallis, a self-described atheist, argued at length in his book, Aping Mankind, that all attempts to reduce consciousness to nothing but brain functions have failed and cannot but fail. The next year, 2012, one of the most distinguished analytical philosophers in the world, Thomas Nagel of NYU, unsettled naturalists committed to reductionistic materialism with his short book, Mind and Cosmos, the subtitle of which is Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Reviewers expressed shock and horror, appalled that Nagel acknowledged the influence on his thinking of intelligent design critics of Darwinism, and risked giving comfort to religious believers, even as, in their view, he was giving up on serious philosophy. Yet significantly, Nagel, like Tallis, is an atheist and explicitly notes his disdain for theism. He simply does not think materially reductionist accounts of physical processes alone, whether any currently available or that might ever become available, could explain objective values, the experience of first-person subjective awareness, or the human capacity to rise above conscious sensation and perception per se to the comparative weighing of evidence and alternatives and the grasping of truth through rationality. Quote, what has to be explained is not just the lacing of organic life with a tincture of qualia, but the coming into existence of subjective individual points of view, a type of existence logically distinct from anything describable by the physical sciences alone. Or again, quote, just as consciousness cannot be explained as a mere extension or complication of physical evolution, so reason cannot be explained as a mere extension or complication of consciousness. In Nagel's estimation, this means the entire evolutionary process must be rethought in such a way so as to include non-material reality, because we know that the evolutionary process taken as a whole has produced the organisms we are. Materialism is incomplete, he says, even as a theory of the physical world, since the physical world includes conscious organisms among its most striking occupants. This leads him in turn to question the possibility of abiogenesis as a strictly physical process, presumably involving extremely complex protein folding and the formation of amino acids a step along the way. How this or anything else might actually have led to self-replicating life is still a complete mystery, but remains an important promissory article of faith among reductionists committed to what Nagel somewhat mischievously calls a materialism and Darwinism of the gaps. No viable account, he says, even a purely speculative one, seems to be available of how a system as staggeringly functionally complex and information-rich as a self-reproducing cell, controlled by DNA, RNA, or some predecessor, could have arisen by chemical evolution alone from a dead environment, unquote. Nagel's aversion to theism leads him to favor some sort of still unknown integrated naturalistic explanation of a new kind, a non-materialistic natural order that would incorporate natural teleology or teleological bias, even though he knows this is, quote, a throwback to the Aristotelian conception of nature banished from the scene at the birth of modern science. But insofar as modern science has depended on bracketing mental phenomena from reality, carrying on with mechanistic materialism as if they didn't exist, it might not be surprising if the existence of mental phenomena and their categorical irreducibility to matter energy turns out to be one of the obstacles that ultimately undermines naturalism. Yet finally, naturalism has a bigger, even more fundamental problem than the mystery of consciousness, first-person experience, intentionality, and rationality, and that is, quite simply, the fact of existence, period. That there is anything whatsoever, none of which accounts or can account for its own existence. Properly grasp the radical contingency of everything that exists, and that the natural sciences investigate or could investigate, is a logical and metaphysical death knell for naturalism at a more fundamental level. It is part of expanded reason's revenge on the unjustified restriction of reason to the epistemological imperialism of scientism. And this recognition is itself the product of the exercise of reason, a faculty capable of distinguishing empirical from conceptual questions, and of understanding that nothing whatsoever in nature, nor nature as a whole, can explain its own existence. Now, there are plenty of physicists who well understand this, and they realize that their discipline can only study physical processes and natural laws, not how or why there are any physical processes or natural laws whatsoever. But metaphysical naturalists who believe in physics as first philosophy do not see this. Some think, for example, that if we can explain everything back to the instant of the Big Bang, down to the most basic initial natural conditions that were followed by the expansion of the universe with such incomprehensible power and accelerating velocity, we would have explained the mystery of existence per se. An entirely physical naturalist cosmology would be equivalent to a comprehensive ontology. But this is confused and ultimately irrational. It fails to recognize that whatever the most elementary conditions and character were of natural reality at the moment of the Big Bang, they are ontologically no less contingent, no more capable of explaining the fact of their existence than is our universe in its highly differentiated form 13.7 billion years later. To see this is to realize the rational inference that follows. Something ontologically beyond or outside the entire natural order that is not contingent must exist. Something which can and does in principle and in fact account for the existence of the natural order, even though how this is so remains not merely obscure, but incomprehensible. On the other hand, to insist that there must be something ontologically contingent that is just there, that the natural order or natural laws or the basic physical constituent realities of the universe are somehow simply a given and whose existence need not be explained, is an abdication of reason at the analytical endpoint of the rational process that seeks to understand the totality of human experience, human history, the natural history of our world, and the history of the universe, by showing the interconnected, integral character of different sorts of knowledge gained through all the academic disciplines. Positing any brute facticity of existence to the universe, nature, natural laws, or the like amounts to physics refusing to yield to philosophy, not simply when it should, but when, if it follows its own principles, it must, provided those principles are well understood. A failure to yield indicates a failure to understand what science itself can and cannot do, what the natural sciences are, in contrast to what they cannot be. It is symptomatic of the unwarranted metastasis of naturalism into a metaphysical assertion. I'm going to illustrate this difference by comparing arguments from two books, the arrestingly titled A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing by the American cosmologist Lawrence Krauss, and The Experience of God, Being Consciousness Bliss by the American philosopher and theologian David Bentley Hart. Like other scientists who write well for a general audience, Krauss can be engaging when he is discussing the extraordinary discoveries in cosmology and the remarkable features of our universe as disclosed over the last century. But when he endeavors to make good on the claim in his book's title and subtitle, he quickly shows that he either cannot or does not want to escape from the self-imposed prison of restricted reason that he inhabits. The results are unfortunate. An alert reader is bound to be puzzled already in the table of contents with chapter titles that include "Nothing is Something" and "Nothing is Unstable." And in the preface, one can see that things are unlikely to go well. Krauss concedes that, quote, "We may never have enough empirical information to resolve this question unambiguously, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, unaware that no amount could ever be enough." He demonstrates from within the confines of his constricted naturalist worldview that he really does not comprehend what is at issue. Quote, "For surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. The philosophers and theologians, he opines, have been, quote, focusing on questions of nothingness without providing any definition of the term based on empirical evidence," unquote. I promise these are all exact, direct quotations. With prefatory statements such as these, it's not surprising that nowhere in his book does Krauss even engage the question he ostensibly seeks to answer. He seems unaware that the empirical and theoretical questions of physics on which he focuses are different from, quote, "the possible question of what, if anything, fixed the rules that govern such creation," a notion which throughout he conflates with the temporal origins of the universe. And ironically, he is correct, although he means to be disparaging, when he states that, quote, "the metaphysical rule that out of nothing, nothing comes has no foundation in science." Indeed. But instead of recognizing here the limits of scientific inquiry and the starting point for a different kind of rational reflection, in his scientism, Krauss tries to force an empirical scientific answer on a question that cannot in principle have one. Shortly after drawing as near as he comes to grasping the difference between a physical and a metaphysical question, he absurdly suggests that a conceptualization of multiverses in which, quote, "the laws of nature are themselves stochastic and random," unquote, could circumvent the ontological contingency of those stochastic random laws. Hence, everywhere in his book, nothing or nothingness turns out to mean some primordially basic, already existing natural condition or quality of the very early universe, or occasionally its post-entropic end state billions of years in the future. Nowhere in his exposition does nothing or nothingness mean ontological non-existence. Krauss concedes that, quote, "it would be disingenuous to suggest that empty space endowed with energy, which drives inflation of the universe after the Big Bang, is really nothing. In this picture, one must assume that space exists and can store energy, and one uses the laws of physics like general relativity to calculate the consequences," unquote. Exactly. This is extremely interesting and, if true, takes its place alongside the other astonishing findings that cosmologists and particle physicists have contributed to our knowledge. It also has absolutely nothing to do with ontological nothingness. In contrast, David Bentley Hart's experience of God reflects deep learning about the histories of science, Western and Eastern philosophy, and religious traditions, and is knowledgeable about modern physics in its relationship to metaphysical questions. My concern here is limited to a very specific point relevant to metaphysical naturalism and ontological contingency. Hart sees clearly that the sheer facticity of the existence of all realities that do not explain their own existence, which is to say, everything in the universe that we know of or can encounter in any academic discipline by means of whatever methods, and including the universe considered as a whole, implies that they must, as a matter of both metaphysical and logical necessity, owe not simply their particular coming to be, but the continuing fact of their existence to something that is not itself another contingent reality in need of precisely the same explanation. This is what all of the world's religious traditions have understood by God. I will come back to this in a moment. Note that this argument is neither a form of the ontological argument for God's necessary existence associated with St. Anselm, in which a perfect being must exist because perfection entails existence, nor is it a form of the traditional argument from design, of the sort frequently associated today with proponents of so-called intelligent design arguments for God's existence. Quite apart from any considerations of faith or religious belief, the ontological contingency of all things that exist, have ever existed, or will ever exist, and the conclusion that there must therefore be some non-contingent reality that explains their existence and is metaphysically distinct from all of them, is a strictly rational inference. In other words, recognition of the inadequacy of metaphysical materialist naturalism is not a religious objection or a matter of faith, which is sometimes implied even by theologians. Rather, this unavoidable rational inference about a necessary transcendent source and sustaining ground of being does not entail faith in God as understood much more expansively and elaborately in religious traditions such as Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. In other words, it is philosophically very strong, but prima facie, at least, religiously rather weak. That said, it is not unimportant that these traditions have for millennia understood that the God of faith possesses logically singular attributes that are shared with attributes of the rationally inferred ground of all contingent beings. Again, more about this in a moment. What Hart sees that Krauss does not is that even a complete empirical explanation of the universe extending back to and including the Big Bang would never be an account of either why or how there is anything at all, rather than nothing. Physics could never, even in principle, function as first philosophy, nor could all of the sciences taken together and including even all possible discoveries at every scale from the subatomic to the cosmological, including all possible multiverses, if such exist. In principle, explain the existence of what it is that they study. In Hart's words, quote, "Physical reality cannot account for its own existence for the simple reason that nature, the physical, is that which by definition already exists. Existence, even taken as a simple brute fact to which no metaphysical theory is attached, lies logically beyond the stream of causes that nature comprises. It is quite literally hyperphysical, or, shifting into Latin, super naturam. This means not only that at some point nature requires or admits of a supernatural explanation, which it does, but also that at no point is anything purely self-sufficiently natural in the first place. In other words, quote, there simply cannot be a natural explanation of existence as such. It is an absolute logical impossibility. Efforts such as Krauss's imply that the closer we get temporally to the Big Bang in our physical explanation about the universe, or the simpler are the physical states and natural laws out of which the universe developed, the closer the natural sciences get to explaining everything. But such attempts overlook the irrelevance of their findings for the question of ontological contingency. Quote, no purely physical cosmology has any bearing whatsoever upon the question of existence. And so it is immaterial here how small, simple, vacuous, or impalpably indeterminate a physical state or event is. It is still infinitely removed from non-being and infinitely incapable of having created itself out of nothing. Again, it is extremely interesting. Indeed, it's astounding that the cosmically elaborated universe in which we live today seems to have developed as it has from so few initial conditions and states. Anyone who cares about knowledge ought to be grateful for what physicists have done to disclose the mind-blowing nature of our universe. But to think that reducing everything to its most basic, original conditions and constituents at the moment of the Big Bang would be to arrive at a sort of ontological ground zero of nothingness, simply broadcasts to the world one's incomprehension of what the contingency of existence means. In fact, Hart writes, quote, one will be starting no nearer to non-being than if one were to begin with an infinitely realized multiverse. The difference from non-being remains infinite in either case. To see this is to understand the point at issue. A corollary of Hart's argument is that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is a truth of reason. It is not simply something that religious believers happen to affirm based on faith, as is sometimes implied, but also, and more basically, a rational inference about the impossibility of an infinite regress of contingently dependent beings, given the obvious reality that any exist at all. The manner in which dependent beings exist qua existence, as distinct from the natural causes and forces that account for them coming into existence as they have and being the sorts of natural things that they are, which is of course what physics and the other natural sciences study, cannot itself be the result of simply another antecedent cause and force of the same sort. Hence the term creation. In fact, their existence per se must be radically different in kind, of a sort that literally, albeit incomprehensibly, has its source in what can and does create everything out of nothing. And logically, although again incomprehensibly, it must be creation out of nothingness, because anything antecedent that was not self-subsisting of its very character would be another contingent dependent being in need of the same sort of explanation. Whatever all of the natural sciences taken together explain about how everything that exists fits together is a conceptually different story, the objects of which study are entirely and necessarily included within the metaphysically and logically more fundamental account of their existence. Because no discipline, whether in the natural sciences, social sciences, or humanities, studies anything that doesn't exist at all. For anything to exist, there must be a non-contingent source and sustaining ground of all contingent beings. Any fundamental, systematic, rational reflection on reality, regardless of where and in what discipline it begins, cannot but end here. Thus Hart rightly says that, quote, naturalism, the doctrine that there is nothing apart from the physical order and certainly nothing supernatural, is an incorrigibly incoherent concept and one that is ultimately indistinguishable from pure magical thinking, unquote. Now, is this sustaining ground of all contingent beings God? It seems to me not only intellectually correct, but also prudently wise to note both the features that this source of creation ex nihilo shares with God as understood in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, say, as well as the possibility of rationally affirming the reality of this source of creation without necessarily affirming a further faith commitment. This distinction provides a basis for arguing against the constrictive scourge of metaphysical naturalism without immediately raising the additional fraught, complicated issue of faith and religion. An important consideration, in my opinion, given the character of our current prevailing intellectual culture. Strategically, this distinction opens a space for rational dialogue, at least with those who are not fundamentalists in their materialism, to question and, if they are rational, eventually to reject metaphysical naturalism, without any concurrent pressure also to make some sort of faith commitment. Who knows, maybe eventually they'll come around to faith as well. Creating a non-threatening space for dialogue seems desirable from a pragmatic point of view, considering how many problematic expressions of religion are evident in the world today, which tend to render many direct efforts of proselytization ineffectual. They turn people off. So too, resistance to religion is sure to come from ingrained habits of self-determination and individualist autonomy, so widespread, especially in the modern West, and the pervasive assumption that any and all religion compromises this autonomy in depressive ways. Prudentially, it seems wise to distinguish a God of the philosophers from the God of faith. At the same time, it would be contrived to ignore the overlap between the rationally entailed features of the former and many of the traditional attributes of God as understood in the monotheistic traditions. The creator ex nihilo, who is one, necessarily exists, is eternal in the sense of atemporal, not everlasting, is transcendent, sustains all contingent beings, is infinitely powerful, and is incomprehensible. Whether this God also called the ancient Israelites as his chosen people, or became incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth in first century Palestine, or revealed himself to his last and greatest prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, are additional, analytically distinct questions. Yet they are not questions about some other God, but rather about the only one, whose reality and sustaining power explains how and why anything exists at all. And far from trivially, this is the same God whose existence, if more than just a matter of metaphysical and logical necessity, is also the ground and source of the uninvented values, meaning, moral norms, and sense of purpose affirmed by these religious traditions, and which a materialist naturalism does not and cannot provide. Insufficient time remains for me to develop the positive implications of this understanding of God for Catholic theology, but I want at least to gesture to some of them. Keeping the rationally inferred metaphysical transcendence of God clearly in mind insulates us against the tendency, unconsciously reinforced by ordinary language, to speak and think of God as a highest being among other beings. a comparatively greatest demiurge within existence, rather than the logically necessary prior ground for any and all possible and actual contingent beings. The similarly incomprehensible eternity of God, a reality for whom there is no passage of time, eliminates the tendency to think of God as a cosmic supercomputer, somehow able to process simultaneously all the data of all events in the universe in real time over 13.7 billion years. God's transcendence means God needs no room to be what he is, and so, being in no sense spatial, points to how God could be present to every bit of matter energy, including dark matter and dark energy, not outside of God's providence. No less than his eternity points to how he could be present to every moment in the history of all possible universes. This is important for a theology of divine providence because it is precisely God's metaphysical transcendence that, far from precluding, entails his presence in and through all physical reality. And God's radical, incomprehensible otherness helps provide a way for thinking about the nature of Christ as truly human and truly divine, rather than a partly human, partly divine theological centaur, as well as for a sacramentality, underpinning a robust sacramental theology in which grace can be and is present in and through the material world, because the material world, as creation, is not and can never be devoid of God's sustaining presence as the necessary ground of all that exists. To be blunt, God could not become incarnate in Jesus, and the sacraments God could become incarnate in Jesus, and the sacraments can convey grace because metaphysical naturalism, with its abstracted, mistaken view of matter as mere and separated from its supernatural sustaining source, is a false, irrational view of reality. To conclude, we have all heard countless times and continue repeatedly to hear variations of a narrative in which the rise of modernity beginning in the 17th century meant that a purely natural, scientific, empirical, materialist, anti-supernatural worldview progressively and gradually displaced pre-modern, pre-scientific religious worldviews whose proponents superstitiously believed in supernatural reality because science has shown that everything that exists can be explained or will eventually be explained via its empirical reductionist methods. This narrative is not only mistaken, but radically irrational. It presupposes an obliviousness of the conditions necessary for its own existence by neglecting the conditions necessary for the existence of anything at all. Obviously, it would be absurd if humanistic scholars and social scientists thought that Homo sapiens, whose complex cultures and histories they study, could somehow just be there without the evolution of life on our planet. Similarly, it would be ridiculous for cell biologists to claim that the molecular and genetic processes they study could somehow just be there without the chemical compounds made of the physical elements involved in all of those processes. And so too, but for a different kind of reason, physicists and cosmologists, and anyone else for that matter, would be foolish and irrational to think that the universe itself, at its most basic laws and constituent realities antecedent to the formation of the lightest elements in the Big Bang, could just be there. Expanded reason includes seeing how all the disciplines contribute in different ways to our understanding of reality, not only at dissimilar spatial and temporal scales and with respect to their divergent subject matters, but also through their respectively appropriate methods that subvert the epistemological ideology of scientism. Starting from any expertise in any field within any of the disciplines, expanded reason means exercising our capacity to think beyond the crippling misconceptions and the dangerous dogmas born of metaphysical naturalism. The combination of metaphysical naturalism, moral relativism, philosophical liberalism, assertive individualism, and neoliberal capitalism, how's that for a string of isms, is indeed based on a constricted understanding of reason, but it is doing incredibly expanded damage to human beings and to the planet. I take this to be the most basic point of Laudato Si. For those of us who care about reason and truth, expanded reason, and the fullness of truth, now is not the time to sit on the sidelines in quiet resignation or nostalgic yearning. the fate of souls, and our shared life on the only planet we have hang in the balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gregory, for such an interesting and expanded recent keynote address. We don't have time to open a discussion right now, but I'm sure many of us will approach you along the day with questions and comments, so be ready.
I'll be ready. And if I speak again another year, I will take on a big topic. Thank you.
Para poder disfrutar de todo esto con el debido sosiego, vamos a retrasar media hora todo el programa. Ahora nos vamos a las mesas redondas. Una, como sabéis, es en la pecera de aquí y otra en la pecera del edificio E. Para los que venís de fuera, pecera es el hall acristalado que hay en la planta baja de cada edificio. Os pido, por favor, eso sí, agilidad en los desplazamientos para no perder tiempo en ese ir y venir. Entonces, los que vais a la mesa de psicología en el edificio E y las mesas de por la tarde comenzarán a las 4 en lugar de las 3:30.